Well, it's me. It's David Lancefield, the strategy coach, the founder of Strategy Shift, and the host of Lancefield on the Line, on my own for the first time, maybe the last time. It feels rather indulgent. Perhaps it will be a new thing. Perhaps it won't. Let's see. But this is the 100th edition of the podcast. Wow. Of course, it was all part of the plan. Well, no, it wasn't actually. It just sort of happened. And I'm going to talk about the journey in the coming minutes, not hours, minutes of this edition. I firstly wanted to say a big thank you to you, the audience, for listening, for being encouraging, to sharing comments, suggestions, and also to the guests, of course, all of them, all 100 of them, particularly the ones at the beginning where I didn't have much of a name. I reached out to them, they were gracious, and they turned up and they did a great job. I'm also very, very grateful to Steve Gibson for his design work and Chris Hall-Franz-Kowiak for his podcast editing. He does a brilliant job over the last 50 episodes and more. I'm also grateful for the other podcast hosts, plenty of them, who offered tips and encouragement and suggestions as I was learning the craft, and I'm still learning. So what do I want to cover today? Well, I do want to talk a bit about what I've learned about the podcast process, both as a host and guest. And that may be relevant if you are one of them, but also if you are perhaps a keynote speaker, a coach, or an executive in front of somebody, giving a presentation, having a conversation. I also hope that you take away some insights on the topics that we've been covering, which are strategy, leadership, organizational culture, and of course, self-development. I'm going to be drawing out some of the themes, some of the connections between them, and some of the more controversial topics, and maybe some of the missing elements. I also may cover a little bit on my own development, both as a podcast host and a person over the last 4 years. So that's what we want to cover. That's what I want you to go away with. Let's start with some stats, shall we? Of course, 100 episodes, 4 years, fortnightly, mostly fortnightly, a break sometimes for holidays. Both you need a break, I need a break. And now I'm pleased to say the podcast is in the top 5 in terms of listenership across the world, according to Listen Notes, and has a listen score of 33. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's pretty high. So what are the top 3 episodes? Well, Roger Martin, the first conversation with the brilliant Roger Martin, the topic being strategies about imagination, choices and capabilities. That's had 18,000 views on YouTube alone. Second was Suzanne Hayward, talking about and learning from her childhood in her book, described brilliantly in her book, Wave Walker. And thirdly, Herminia Ibarra, Professor Herminia Ibarra of the London Business School, talking about career transitions and how to master them. It's really hard to get aggregate scores and aggregate numbers across episodes, but they were the big ones. I started the podcast because, quite simply, I wanted a conversation. I'd come from a big consultancy. I was starting on my own as a solopreneur, starting a podcast, and starting a portfolio. And I wanted to reach out to people. I wanted to build my brand, build my name. And I thought a podcast would be a great idea. I also wanted to do something. You know, when you're in a reasonably big role, it's all about leverage. Leverage is fine, but I wanted to sort of roll my sleeves up and, really learn the craft. And I specifically didn't have a niche. Everyone was saying to me, David, you've got to go for a specific leadership podcast or one on career transitions or the entrepreneurial life. And I wanted to wander. And I've been criticized for that, but I wanted to create a smorgasbord, if you like, of topics in the topics of leadership and management and some of the connections and the collisions between them. And frankly, I wanted to cover topics that I really enjoy because putting a podcast together is pretty hard work, I can tell you. So I wanted to enjoy it throughout. And as soon as I stop enjoying it, I will stop the podcast. I've obviously seen myself at a slightly more superficial level. I've seen myself a bit thinner, a bit fatter, different haircuts, different shades of on my skin, depending on holidays and various other things, and different attire. So that's been quite revealing, at least to me, if nobody else. So that's a little bit of an overview of the podcast. I'd like to talk about what it takes to be a good podcast guest. And of course, that's my own experience as a host. I'm also been a guest on other podcasts, and I hope I've been a good one. So let me start here. the starting point really is about just be a good guest. Just be easy to deal with. So when you send off an email, be easy to deal with. Don't be high maintenance. Don't be a prima donna. You may have a PA, you may have a marketing person, an agency. Just cut through the frictions. Many do, some don't. If you're working with an agency, just be careful about how they're representing you. The number of times I get emails from people saying, this is a highly personalized email approaching you to be on your podcast, David. They get my name wrong, they get the podcast name wrong, and they get the genre wrong. And they could give me an exclusive interview. And then I ask what exclusive is, and exclusive actually means it's just special. And that person is on many, many podcasts, as many people are. So just be good to deal with. I guess linked to that, show up for the conversation. Show you want to be there. Have some energy and some oomph. You may have done 5 other podcasts already that day. This may be the 100th or more podcast. But for me, as the host, this is probably our first interaction, at least on a podcast. So make it special. It might even be your best one yet. And with that, start with a smile. Light your eyes up. You're trying to create a spark in the conversation. This is not a keynote. This is not a presentation. It should be a conversation that people, are delighted to listen into. As you're having that conversation, use some memorable quote, a quote, a story, a fact. One, because it makes the conversation more interesting, but also it's easier, frankly, to edit. It's easier to capture, to market when you're then promoting the podcast. It's more memorable, very importantly, for the audience. And as I've just done, stop talking for a while. The podcast host wants to ask a number of questions. The audience needs a bit of a breather. So stop talking. When you got to your end of your first point, just be confident in yourself and say, okay, I'm done. Of course, avoid all the filler words. I'm no doubt guilty of that myself. But also try to avoid that's an excellent question, David. I get a lot of that, and I'm delighted because they are really, really good questions. That's a filler. That's a stopgap when the person's thinking. It gets a bit annoying after a while too. Now, most people coming on to a podcast are looking to promote something, typically a book. And hey, it's really obvious, and they might have a big book behind them, and I might show the book. But this is not about reading out a few chapters or just literally reading out the key points from the book. I want the essence of the book to come out, and I also want to find some shades, some nuances, some parts that perhaps that haven't got into the book. So as you're thinking about it, let it infuse the conversation, but don't make it too prominent. The best way to promote yourself is having a great conversation, and we can share all the details of the book and your coaching, your speaking, or your company later on. A few more don'ts. Don't go on autopilot where you switch off. You can see it in the eyes, especially in the edit afterwards, where it's like, okay, this is another one. I'm just rolling on. As I said, don't treat it as a keynote. And also, don't be half asleep. I mean, some people, and I won't name them, it'd be a lot more interesting if I did. You can tell they've just sort of rocked up. They just finished their last call or breakfast or lunch or dinner, and they're not quite ready mentally, physically, and it takes them 5 to 10 minutes to get into the conversation. And I'm putting a lot into it. I sort of want somebody, a bit like on the start line, to be ready to go. And I think being a good podcast guest is actually a craft. It's a skill. So you may be a great coach, advisor, speaker, executive, whatever you are. And in some cases, they are transferable skills. In other cases, they're not. You sort of have to work it and treat it as such. It is a great promotion. It's half an hour, 40 minutes, an hour of your time, the host time, and then all of the social media coverage that goes with it. So put your best foot forward, learn the craft. And I remember one conversation, actually a couple, where at the end, somebody said, how was I doing? I think it was Dina Denham Smith, early on when she was promoting her brilliant book that she co-authored on called Emotionally Charged. She asked, how did I do? And I thought, I think that's probably the first person, or maybe the second, to ask that question. So in the moment, I gave some feedback. And firstly, it builds a bit of a connection. Secondly, it's a bit of a, wow, yeah, this person really wants to learn. It's great in terms of the mindset that it conveys too. So that's some thoughts on being a great podcast guest. And I hope that's relevant to different roles you play in your life too. So what have I learned about being a good podcast host? That's a bit arrogant, isn't it? Well, I try to be a good podcast host. Well, I guess first of all, the conversation starts well before the recording. It's in the email. It's in the brand that you convey. Any other form of communications you have with the person, the guest directly, or their agent or their marketeer. And try to be clear when you are communicating about the audience, the impact, the experience you're looking to create in the podcast. Be really explicit. I remember being a guest on Michael Bungay Stanier's brilliant Change Signal podcast, and he sent me a short video where he did exactly that. A few minutes. Oh, I get it. I get what you're trying to experience. It helps the guest position themselves, position the conversation the way that the host wants. I've also been reasonably clear, at least in my head at the beginning, and also actually more publicly in various posts about the criteria I use for the guests. I want a great conversationalist. I mentioned that. I want somebody who's got a perspective, a point of view, quite opinionated, but also somebody who's willing to debate it, is not stubborn. Somebody with a following is great because we do want to promote the podcast. And also somebody, as I mentioned, who's easy to deal with. I'm not up for 4 or 5 pre-meetings beforehand. I don't have the time, the money, the attention to do so. So those are the criteria, and I would be explicit about them. I've also been really clear on trying to get a range of different voices, different backgrounds, countries, styles, races across race, gender, sexuality, not for political correctness, but because I want to hear from different people. I want to reflect, at least an attempt to reflect, the society in which we operate in. And frankly, it's much more stimulating than having a Me Too conversation or a mini-me conversation, which frankly is often very predictable and frankly dull. So in terms of the practicalities that come from that, once you've set the intention, you've set out your criteria, I set out a number of topics to the guest in advance, a number of questions actually, having read all of their work. And I'm quite assiduous with the preparation. It's not suggesting that I'm going to go through every particular question, but it gives a flavor of the flow, gives a flavor of the topics, and I'm also trying to avoid surprises. Unlike other interviews, I'm not looking to trick them. I may be looking to have a bit of a laugh, maybe provoke a little bit, but I'm not looking to embarrass them. I'm looking to promote them, their ideas, their brand. So putting that out in front of them beforehand gives them time to prepare, also gives the sense that I'm taking it seriously. I'd encourage you to take it seriously, and actually gets them to call out any questions or topics they are sensitive to. And I'd say about a quarter of people, perhaps a bit less, do call out topics that either they don't feel well placed to talk about or feel a bit sensitive to. And I always respect that. There's the practicalities, and then there's the mindset. I've spent a lot of time, particularly in the last few years, getting my mindset right. And I guess the more relaxed I am, the more grateful I am for the conversation with the person. They are giving their time for free. I'm not paying them. The more I'm going to genuinely lean into it, enjoy it, immerse myself into it, switch off everything else. So that's about scheduling time in the diary beforehand to make sure I'm not rushing. It's remembering that although I'm now, at the time of this recording, 50 years old, I've got plenty to learn about. So I try and shed any arrogance that I may have. We all have a degree of arrogance, but I try to shed that. And then I'm really searching for the best in the person. So I go in with a very, very positive intent, a positivity and an energy that, and I compliment them because I genuinely believe they're doing good work. They wouldn't be on the podcast otherwise. And I think and I hope, and Frankly, I know that comes through, particularly in the opening remarks, and that creates a bit of a buzz, a bit of excitement, a bit of energy, and then we riff from there on and in. So if you are a host, whether you're a podcast host or you're chairing a conference or a big meeting, get your mindset right. Spend a bit of time. It's not woo-woo. It's really, really important. I do prepare. I try and get the technology right. I prepare my notes. Of course, there are some things that go wrong. I may come back to that later. But when you are in the conversation, once you've prepared yourself, stay in the moment. Immerse yourself, as I said. Really dig in, drill into the topic, the question. Yes, I may wander from time to time, but there's also something about trusting myself, and I hope the guests do this. Trusting in me to move us to some form of joint end, because it's a as Pierre Lorison said, it's a conversation is a bit of a dance. We're moving together. It's not I ask a question, you respond, question, answer. There's a bit of that, but that becomes very, very predictable, very boring. And I do get nervous from time to time, particularly for the bigger names. Everyone's a name, of course, but some are bigger than others. Particularly people who have a bit of a reputation, perhaps of being challenging. And I'm going to mention some of those later. So, but I use the nerves to create a bit of pace and energy. But also I recognize I've been in thousands of conversations over the last 30 years. This is just another conversation. That helps me ground myself. I also, at the end, for listeners who've got that far, I also share how I feel at the end. That's not scripted. What did I feel about the conversation? What did I take away? And that gratitude that comes out at the end. As I've been doing that and learning about hosts, what have I learned and what have I changed? Well, I did it all by myself at the beginning, and that was fine. And I think I did it reasonably well. And it meant that when I did go out to get some help with the editing, the mastering, and the production process, I knew what I was looking for. And I could cut through some of the BS of some of the agencies who said, oh, this is going to take an hour. I'm like, I know that takes 5 minutes. So bringing in people who are better, and Chris is better at the craft than me. And so I'm grateful to have him on board. The other thing I've learned is how I feel in that moment and how I feel beforehand matters as much, if not sometimes more important, than all of the content and ideas that I have in my head. I take those as a given because I've done a lot of preparation. But the energy is really important, and my mindset and feeling grounded. I've also learned and changed that when we get into the more personal aspects of the topic, that may be about motivation or fears of the employees, the citizens, the customers that they're talking about, if they're describing their research, or their own personal motivations and fears, that's when you have a different conversation. I'm careful not to delve too deeply, especially if I don't know them that well. But that's when you get a softer tone. That's when you get a bit more reflection. That's where you hear about the stuff you might not hear about in other places. That's the gold dust. But it takes a time to warm that up. And it has to be done with the right intent, the right ethical intent. The last thing I'll say is, as a host, and I say this with a cheekiness, but also a sense of reality, is don't expect too much of the guest in terms of promotion. I've been surprised, a bit disappointed, frankly, sometimes, how some of the guests have been delighted with the conversation and then done little to nothing on promoting the conversation. And I guess because they moved on. So you sort of have to do the promotion yourself. You've got to drive it yourself and put your own spin an angle on the conversation rather than just taking the transcript and using ChatGPT to summarize it. So that's what I've learned about being a podcast host, and I hope that's helpful to you. I mentioned ChatGPT. I've been reflecting on the themes and all the 100 episodes, and I asked my friend ChatGPT for some help in drawing out some of the themes I gave, whether it's transcripts, the titles, the people, And I asked for it to help me draw out some of the themes. So this is a combination of my own thoughts and the thoughts of ChatGPT. And of course, the most prevalent themes are intentionally around strategy, and really strategy, which I think is the anchor for all of this, the foundation. Strategy, leadership, culture, and self-development, and the intersections between it. I haven't been rigid in saying, oh, I'm going to have this proportion on this topic. It's been where my interests have moved, where I think there's been some great thinking, some new thinking I should tap into, and also, candidly, some availability of people. So it's trying to create that and getting the right mix and flow from the big, big picture topics, whether it's about systemic change, leading an outrage, higher ground, those sorts of topics, all the way into the very personal topics of how we communicate, how we think in terms of neuroscience, and so forth. So what are those themes? I think the first one is that strategy really is a human endeavor. I mean, I featured guests of Roger Martin, who I mentioned, Rita McGrath, Felix Oberholzer, Guy, Bill Fisher, Costas Markides, Alex Smith, and many more. Brilliant brains, brilliant strategic thinkers. And what's come through is the quest for clarity. What is strategy? What isn't it? How do you actually do it? And also, how do we bring the human dimension alive? Because ultimately, strategy is about people making smarter choices, better choices, more coherent choices to help them fulfill an ambition that's important to them, to move them from the current to the future, taking account where relevant of the past. So we've talked about how we use AI to power strategy. We've talked about how you open it up to the organization, how you simplify it. And so strategies really become around how do you develop the right mindsets, the right thinking, the right conversations in organizations. It's not a static process. It's not a series of PowerPoints presentations. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of making decisions. It's a way of adapting to what happens. So that's my first reflection on strategy as a human endeavor. I hope I've shown a healthy degree of curiosity. So we've talked about curiosity and rebel talent from Francesca Gino. We talked about learning from Chinese leaders. We've talked about reframing work balance from Dan Pontefract. We've also talked about how to fix problems fast with oodles of curiosity from Anne Morris and Francis Fry. And I hope that's shown that I'm passionate about trying to understand, not only in the conversation, but in their work, how do you pique the curiosity of the people you work with? How do you get them to think more deeply, bigger, more systemically? And part of that also is how do you get people to ask more questions, better questions? The more senior we get, the more that we think that actually we have to know it all. And of course, you do have to have some knowledge. I don't believe you have to, I don't believe it. I'm not anti the know-it-all perspective, but it's when you believe that's it. So how do you pique your curiosity where you share your expertise, but actually you call out where you don't know, where you want to know something more, where you reach out to perhaps some voices that haven't been heard and you ask them open, clear, simple questions. And then very importantly, you listen. You listen to their answers attentively. And hopefully you find a way to bring it all together and co-create some form of better solution, better product, better service, whatever it is you're looking at. I mentioned diversity. That's been an intention. And when you look at the guests, you look at the topics, I think I've had a pretty good stab at the diversity of perspective. I've had guests from academia, consulting, entrepreneurship, sport, music, activism, and many more. And we've talked about everything from, as I mentioned, systemic change, the impact of AI, how people lead organizations, particularly with more heart, more courage, more ethics, more honesty. I've talked about strategy, of course. And then how do we manage ourselves, whether it's in transition to some form of new leadership role or life transition? And then how do we manage our personal brand? How do we communicate more effectively? How do we make better decisions? How do we spend our time? So we've sort of gone from big picture into the micro behaviors and the micro mindsets. And I would say this, I think that's been intentional, because I think you need a combination of both. And it's actually where, without arrogance, I'm at my best, going from the big picture challenges facing organizations into so what are you going to do differently? What are you going to think differently, say differently, act differently tomorrow, the next day, and beyond? We've also talked about reinvention. Curiosity, yes. Diversity of perspective. Reinvention of organizations, of careers, of ourselves. So Aidan McCullen talked about developing a reinvention mindset. Steve Blank about reinventing entrepreneurship, and he should know, of course. Ruchika Malhotra talking about reinventing culture from the inside out. That's been a big theme, culture, from different angles, from an inclusion angle, from workplace, hybrid versus face-to-face, also the connection of culture to strategy. And of course, we've also talked about reinventing leadership for a world that requires leaders to be more thoughtful, more humble, less hero-like. Gosh, do we need that at the moment as the time of this recording? And you know what I mean by that, particularly in the political world. So Bill George, the eminent leader, ex-CEO and leadership scholar, talked about how do we reinvent leadership authentically? And I guess it shows that we should be in a permanent state of reinvention. That's not to say we're overly self-critical, but our mindset is one where, yes, we're doing, yes, we're deciding, yes, we're shaping our organization, our team, ourselves. But actually, how can we do it better? How do we improve the way we operate? How do we encourage our teams to think in that way? Because it keeps things fresh. It pushes out complacency, and it makes sure we are connected to what matters, which is serving our customers, serving our citizens, and serving the society that we operate in. So those are some of the themes that I drew out with the help of my good friend ChatGPT from all of the podcasts. Now, I had a bit of fun preparing for this. I mean, of course I did. I wanted to enjoy it. I mentioned that. So I asked a number of my guests, and I asked the audience too. I asked a number of my guests to ask some questions of me as if they were the host. And so here's a few of those examples, and I'm going to give my answer here. So first, I asked Amy Gallo, the author of Getting Along and the co-host of the HBR podcast, Woman at Work. And here's what she asked me.
The question I would ask you if I were the host is, what difficult conversations do you see leaders avoiding at this moment that you think they should be having? So rather than turning away from these conversations, which they're doing, which do you think they should be leaning into?
So what are leaders avoiding? Well, I think they're avoiding a conversation with themselves. The inner voice, the inner conversation about what they're really there to do. Whether they're leading the organization with the right clarity, with the right authenticity, the right sense of purpose. And actually whether they're leading the best life for themselves, whether they're congruent with their own personal values, or whether there's a dissonance. I think many leaders don't have a strategy for the organization, the team, or themselves. And when I hear people talking about, oh, let's understand the relationship between strategy and leadership, I don't get it. I don't get it. How can you lead without a strategy? I mean, it's the foundation for leadership. I also think some leaders are missing out on the topic of ethics and honesty and integrity at a time when actually they're being tested right now by big shifts, movements in geopolitics, local politics, and social dynamics. So I think they're shying away from asking the question of, what do you stand for? What will you maybe sacrifice commercially in the short term because you believe in something? And I know it's hard, particularly those with shareholders, listed companies, big pressures. But would a quarter's results that don't look as healthy really matter that much if in 5 years' time you look back on your career and think, I was just complacent, I was weak, I wasn't courageous enough to stand up for what I thought was important? I also asked Josie Thomson, the multi-award winning coach, speaker, and co-author of The Wise Advocate. And here's what Josie asked me.
The two questions I would love to ask you are, in your experience working with senior leaders across industries, what is the most common leadership blind spot that prevents transformational change, and how do you help executives overcome it? That's the first one. The second question is, with increasing complexity and uncertainty in the business world, how do you coach leaders to balance the need for agility and innovation with the discipline required for sustainable execution?
Well, I think there's a blind spot in terms of human motivation. I think they assume that people will follow them if they make their case convincingly, if they push them hard enough. But I think that's done too much at the corporate level. And I think people are assumed to have the same or similar motivations, fears, aspirations, or they put them in particular groups. Whereas, of course, we're all individuals, and it takes time to understand, to surface what they are, and then explore, so what do you need to change? What do you need to change and develop and grow? And I think it's lazy sometimes. I think also the blind spots relate to not calling out the frictions that get in the way of change or the real obstacles. They probably know what they are, but they think it's too hard or it's not their role to tackle them. And then when it comes to sustainable execution, what a great term. For me, it's about creating, it's not about process per se. It's about creating effective thinking systems. How do you lead your life at work and more generally with a real clarity around the problem you're looking to face up to, challenge you're trying to address, what you're trying to become, what's your aspiration, what's your ambition, what are the choices that you have on where to focus, how to differentiate yourself, what to do. And then how do you bring it all together in terms of the organization to support whatever change you think is necessary? I mean, what I've described there simply is strategy. And so I think in terms of sustainable execution, having that sustainable, systemic approach to strategy in everything you do, it's not just a one-off, it's not just a big corporate spiel, really means that you have a way of grounding how you make decisions and how you adapt to changes, to shocks, to surprises as they come. And I think it also means you become more intentional about what you look out for, the signals you draw in. And then when something happens that comes out of the blue, you have a way of thinking through it systemically. Alex Edmonds talked about this in terms of the ladder of misinference. How do you go systemically through the information you collect, how you interpret it, and how you use it, avoiding biases and avoiding misjudgments? So that's my answer to Josie's excellent questions. Tony Martignetti, the founder and chief inspiration officer of Inspired Purpose Partners. What a brilliant set of titles there. And the host of the Virtual Campfire podcast, which I was lucky enough to join. He asked me this question.
What has surprised you the most about your evolution of your podcast, either in the conversations you've had or in your own growth as a host and thought leader?
So what surprised me the most? Well, it's become more and more focused, I think unintentionally at the beginning and now more intentionally, into the human psyche. It's more personal, it's more revealing than perhaps I thought. Not just because I want a great conversation, but it's sort of, how do we get to the heart of how people feel, how they act? Because I think if you can do that, you can harness it. That's the engine for effective change at multiple levels: team, organization, society, systemic, global. Yet how I think many management thinkers, coaches, advisors, executives shy away from it. They think it's too delicate, too sensitive, too hard. Or perhaps they think it's the HR job or somebody else's job to deal with that. I guess I've also been surprised in a good way about how much I've enjoyed it. I think because I've been intentional about the topics and the guests, And I think it's because of that enjoyment that rubs off in terms of how much energy I put into them. I have been sensitive at times about being a host, not because I don't enjoy it, but I believe I am, and I know I am, a strategy advisor, a coach, a management thinker myself. But where I've learned, challenging my own inner critic, is, okay, bring that, David. Bring that into the quality of the questions. Bring that into how you show up in the conversation, how you respond, how you summarize. So actually, it's a sparring conversation, not a please, sir or madam, please tell me what you think type conversation. Thank you, Tony. Dina Denham Smith, I've mentioned already, the co-author of Emotionally Charged and an expert coach and speaker. She asked me this question.
We both share some, I guess, surprises when it came to having your son and my oldest, and just would want to actually learn more about how that shaped you as a human and just your overall experience and trajectory from learning to integrating to celebrating your son and his gifts and your relationship.
Yes. I mean, Dina, we've talked about that. The personal experience has taught me many things. And I say this, and I struggle to say it without feeling a little sensitive, maybe indulgent. It has shown me the fragility and the unpredictability of life. Also how it feels to be excluded from the mainstream. It's something I feel nearly daily. Not necessarily for myself as a parent, but for my son, and actually to a degree, to our family. So I get it. I guess I hope a stronger sense of compassion for, racial groups, women, people from different sexualities, different disabilities, who aren't in the mainstream, who feel marginalized by how people think, how they operate, how they engage with them. I hope I'm more compassionate to that. I guess I also realize that even though the resources, sometimes my mental resources, my energy, I'm doing this podcast reasonably late at night after my son's gone to bed, I can still make some choices. I can choose how I show up, even when I feel depleted. I can choose how I react. I can't always choose where I spend my time. There's professional things I would love to do more of. But actually, I can make more choices than perhaps I think. That's going to be a topic of my future book, and you're going to be hearing more about that. And actually, it's also taught me something about the potential everyone has, even the most disabled people. Everyone, single person in this world has a lot of potential. Everyone can learn. Everyone has a personality. Everyone has emotions. It may not be as visible. You just need to be there with them, get to know them, earn their trust, observe, feel those emotions, and believe in them. Believe in them. And I guess the last reflection on this excellent question, there I've done it, shouldn't have said that, but it is an excellent question, is finding moments of joy in life is an intentional act, even when you're feeling bad, when you're feeling down, when you're in your darkest moments. And it is a possibility for all of us. You just have to look for it, be disciplined about it, and then just relish them, enjoy them, even if you know it's going to be short-lived. Thank you, Dina. Dan Pontefract, the best-selling author, latterly of Work-Life Bloom, and the host of the Leadership Now podcast, which I also was a guest on, he asked me this question.
What has been your most challenging interview and why? Doesn't have to be a person, could be a situation, could be a topic.
Well, I was most nervous for my first conversation with Roger Martin. It was relatively early into the podcast and into my portfolio career. And, Roger's a big name, a big thinker, and he has an authoritative, confident style, and he has a very high quality per word. And I sense he may not suffer suffer fools gladly if I asked a bad question or I made a wrong inference. But I found Roger to be very, very engaging, very generous, very warm. And I've gotten to know him since then. And it's been an absolute pleasure. So yes, I hope I was on my A game or maybe B- game. But he was a wonderful, wonderful guest. I was also reasonably nervous for my conversation with Professor Frances Fry. I didn't know her before. And she'd just written her book with Anne Morris, all about solving problems and changing fast. It's all about speed. And again, like Roger, she has a very high quality per word, very quick thinker. And can I hold her attention? She doesn't do many of these. She has her own brilliant podcast. Will she like me? Will she get on with me? And you know what? We just hit it off. I still don't quite know how or why. I've watched that quite a few times, but it just sort of worked. And she loved the conversation. I was grateful for her kind words afterwards. Professor Stephen Rogelberg, Chancellor's Professor at the University of North Carolina and author of Glad We Met and other books on meetings, he asked me this question.
What would be the guest you would most want to have on your podcast?
Just one? Well, Wynton Marsalis, the world-class trumpeter, composer, musician, rights activist, he would be one. I mean, I've had Alison Balsam, who's, again, another brilliant trumpeter too. But the reason I call out Wynton is he's one of the few musicians who straddled different crafts, different genres. A brilliant classical musician, great jazz musician. He's done solo work, created his own orchestras, bands. So his ability to straddle those, to perfect the craft in the way he does, and how he's devoted his life to it. I mean, he's on tour, it's seemingly all the time. So I've been curious on how he performs at his best, how he moves between particular genres, how he stays at his A game, and also how he leads his life and stays healthy on what is a grueling schedule. And he will have overcome many, many obstacles along the way, given his race and his background. Yet he's excelled. He's overcome them. So I'd love to hear his story of how he's gone about it, what his experience was, and what others can learn from across different racial groups and even people in privileged positions like myself as a white male. The other person, if I was being greedy, would be Stephen Graham, the actor and director, not just because he's, at the time of this recording, just put out his Adolescence series on Netflix, which is utterly stimulating, challenging. It's a phenomenon talking about a major social issue that we're facing. But I'd like to talk to him because his intensity of performance is quite something else. And I'd love to talk to him about how he goes about getting himself in character, how he prepares, particularly in that case, for the one-shot approach to filming, where they literally rehearse beforehand and then they do it in one take, although they may do multiple takes. So how he goes about his craft, how he's moved from different film to film, TV series, and also, very importantly, how he stayed true to himself. If you watch the interviews, as I have, he comes across as a very regular, normal, whatever normal is, accessible person. I mean, he lives in a village in Leicestershire. He doesn't have particularly lavish lifestyle. He's known to his neighbours. How do you stay true to yourself and, not all, and perform at your very, very best in some of the most intensive, challenging, demanding roles? So those would be the two people of many, many others I'd love to interview. Scott D. Anthony, the professor at Tuck Business School, the senior advisor at Insight, and a multi-best-selling author, latterly Eat, Sleep, Innovate. He asked me this question.
Number one, you've had the chance to interview a whole heck of a lot of people. What are the connections that you see across all the disparate views that you have heard? Number two, Are there things that you see that your guests generally miss? One of the things that we all suffer from is the curse of knowledge. We're an expert in something, which is why you have us on your podcast. But sometimes we miss things because, in essence, we know too much. The fish does not know the water in which it swims. What do you know about the water in which we're all swimming? And then third, have you found a power question, a question that reliably elicits something interesting from guests, no matter where they come from?
So first, the connections across the disparate views I've heard. Well, there is a narrative. There is a framework that I think many, if not most guests use, sometimes explicitly, I think often implicitly. So they talk about having a clearer intent, clearer sense of purpose for the organization, for the leader, a strong belief in what they are there to do, what the impact they want to have. They want organizations that are more transparent with bolder ideas, more innovation. They want it to be more customer orientated. They want the organization to act with more intent and speed, with sharper decision making, empowered across the levels, with more self-management and more openness to change. It's a common narrative, and it's of the more progressive organizations. I guess my ask would be, and this applies to myself as an author, would be, if that is a dominant or emerging narrative, how do you draw out your angle to it more distinctly? Often the conversations spend a lot of time on that common narrative in the way I've described. And sometimes I'm like, okay, I get it. Where are you coming in? How are you challenging it? How are you complementing it? How are you supplanting it with your own ideas? And are there things that the guests miss? Well, there's a question which I often ask guests, which is, in effect, how are they living up to their own ideas? Are they coherent with what they talk about, coach about, and advise on in their own practices? Because if they don't, or at least they don't try, that does challenge their integrity and their credibility, at least in my eyes, and I think the audience eyes. And I think sometimes they miss the importance of that. I've also called out the fact that I think they miss that strategy is not some separate act. It's an integrator. It's an integrator of leadership, innovation, and culture. But often people think of it as separate, and I think that's a mistake. So actually they are pursuing those activities and they don't have a clear strategy. They're doing great work on culture, but to what end? How are they helping the organization win? Or they're leading, inspiring their teams to perform better, but actually they're just they're waiting to be disrupted because they're not moving in the right direction. They're not finding the right space. Or they're innovating, great innovation. But again, how does it enable the strategic priorities of the organization? And I think there is a hierarchy, which I think they miss. Yes, it's fluid. Yes, it's connected. Yes, it's adaptive. But there is a hierarchy with strategy being the central part of it. I also think they miss, as I mentioned, the human psyche, going back all the way to neuroscience. These are the underpinnings about how we feel, how we think, how we act, especially some of our psychological flaws. A topic Ron Carucci, the brilliant Ron Carucci, and I have written about and spoken about. I think sometimes people miss the fact that we aren't quite as rational as we might think, and they know that. But then what they propose suggests a degree of rationality, which I don't believe is realistic. So I think we are going to see more about how our brains really power all the way through our organization. Thinking, decisions, actions, impacts. I've been surprised that actually the works, the Josie Thomsons, the Art Kleiners, Jeremy Schwartz, and others on neuroscience, the brilliant work on neuroscience, hasn't permeated more. And I think we've got more to come there. Jeffrey Schwartz, I should have said. I think we're going to hear more about origin stories, where we come from, whether that's as adults or children, and how that shapes how we think, how we behave, how we show up, and how it limits us sometimes, and how we move on from them. I think we are going to hear more, be challenged more by the work of Alex Edmonds and others on the more scientific underpinnings and the rigor of how we think, how we interpret, and how we use that information. I think there are many, many management decisions that are based on misinterpretations, and becomes received wisdom. I think we're beginning to see people understand the need for rigor, not just in academia, but in management too. I think we're also going to see a greater appreciation of the importance of coherence between work and everything else that goes on in our lives. Not about balance, and Dan Pontefract calls us out on that. It's not about balance. It's about integration. It's about making choices. It's about managing the portfolio, being clear about what you can give at different times. And it goes into how does our life outside work help us show up in terms of our motivations? What can we bring into work from our experiences elsewhere? But also, how can we focus at work with our work identity and leave other aspects at home? I think that's often been considered a sort of soft topic, or a topic around how we perform at our best. And of course it's that. But I think it goes much, much deeper into how we lead our lives, how we show up, how it shapes our motivations for the work we do. I also think there's more work to do on how we harness the power of the crowd. Having gone through the 100 podcasts again and loved it, I sort of thought, gosh, imagine if I could pose some really difficult questions to that crowd. I say that as a nice term. The hardest questions that organizations or society are facing right now, and we could crowdsource the answers. Imagine the power of that. And I think there are so many events. I think Davos is guilty of this. Events, conferences, fora, conventions, where they're great places to meet, they're great places to network, to hear people. But imagine if we could tap in to the power of those crowds to solve important problems that really matter to society. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Scott also asked me about a power question. I'm not sure I have one, but one question that does elicit fascinating responses is, what impact are you looking to have on the world around you? Whenever I ask that question, which is at the end of the conversation, and they know it's coming because I trail it in my preparation, in most cases, in many cases, it elicits a smile, a sort of an eye movement to suggest that they're thinking, a softer tone. And I'd say most have a cause that they care about. And the act of me asking in some ways reinforces it in their mind. In some ways it brings it to the fore, reminds them of the importance. And sometimes I think it causes them to challenge whether they are actually living up to it in the work that they're doing. So that would be my power question. Thank you, Scott. Michael Bungay Stanier, the best-selling author of The Coaching Habit, How to Begin and How to Work with Almost Anyone, amongst others, and the host of the Change Signal podcast, asked me this question.
Michael Bungay Stanier here, a long-time listener, one-time guest on Lancefield on the Line. Here's the question I have for you. Knowing that your work is around strategy and helping people be strategic leaders, what is the leadership piece of wisdom that you find hardest to learn for yourself? What's the hard lesson for you when it comes to strategy?
Yes. Well, I find combining my uniqueness, what I think I am uniquely qualified to do, with a degree of humility, what are my strengths? Where is the space I can occupy given my experience, my expertise? And marrying that with what customers, what clients really value. I think I'm reasonably good at it, but there are moments where I think, look, this is really important. You should, what I know or what I think or what you should do is this. And sometimes I get ahead of myself. I was guilty of that in my previous career. I wouldn't suggest I was wrong, but like good comedy, it's all about the timing. So there's no point pushing something that actually customers are not ready for unless you're patient. But finding the sweet spot of understanding what people's needs are. What are they really worrying about? What are they caring about right now? And then marrying that with how can I best serve them at my absolute best? That's the sweet spot. That's what I struggle with sometimes. And that's what I'm working on. Thank you, Michael. Paolo Gallo, the best-selling author of a number of books, including The 7 Games of Leadership and The Compass and the Radar, and an expert executive coach and keynote speaker. He asked me this question.
I would ask you, what did you learn by listening to 100 different people, speakers, authors, thought leaders, CEOs, professors? I'm sure there's been a lot of experience, a lot of learning for you. And I'm wondering which are the 3 main takeaways from this amazing experience?
So the 3 takeaways. Well, I think the first is that the art and the practice of conversation is alive and kicking, as if I need to be reminded. But it is a skill we need to nurture. It is easy to let it slip, especially if you are somebody who's in many formal settings or working on your own. And it's a dance. It's something you have to fully immerse yourself in. It should have some surprises. I think the second one would be that many of us spend too long on the dominant narrative of the moment. I've mentioned this, but I want to say a bit more. Take that as a given. Focus on your differentiation. Find the angles that are not being covered. By all means, connect it so people can access the topic easily. So, for example, there's a lot of work we need to do on systems leadership. But it's a big topic. You may listen to that and think, what do you mean, David? So how can you find the right entry point into the topic which feels too big? Even if you think there isn't enough conversation around how we manage ecosystems of organizations, how we bring organizations together at the systemic level in society to solve problems that really matter, whilst also running organizations that are profitable. That type of systemic leadership is a topic that needs more work. But how do you make it accessible for people so they go, yeah, I get it. Let me contribute, as opposed to it coming across as overwhelming. I think the third thing I take away, Paolo, is there is a need for integration and simplification of these topics. So most of these podcast episodes are on a single topic. That's how I've curated it. And they're sort of vertical views of the world. Let's go deep on workplace culture. Let's go deep on a particular aspect of self-development or the frontiers of strategy. And for good reason, it allows us to focus. But if you're an executive or entrepreneur or founder or other management thinker or coach listening to it, it sometimes can be hard to then use it. Okay, so I've learned a lot more about that particular specialism. How do I then embed that into the next action, the next week, the next month? Yes, you can go on courses online or in business schools. And I think to a degree, they do that integration function. Although a lot of it is around the performance. And I think you lose some of the richness of that integration when you're listening to some of the stars present to you. But I think we can do a better job of simplifying, summarizing and integrating those things. So you give them, if you like, not only a manifesto for new thinking, new acting, but actually a bit of a manual which they can then take it forward. Thank you, Paolo. Melody Wilding, the best-selling author of Trust Yourself and Managing Up and a keynote speaker, she asked me, how has your own leadership philosophy changed as a result of the conversation you've had on the podcast? And what's the one theme or topic that has come up repeatedly that you didn't expect? Well, I guess my own leadership philosophy has changed. I've become even more action-orientated. It's like, okay, that's a great point, but what are we going to do or not do tomorrow, the next day? And I've really tried to focus that in the conversations and draw it out of people. Some people find it easy. Some people like the big picture. But unless you can get to that point, these episodes and any conversation goes into the, oh, that was interesting, wasn't it? And that's not enough for me. I want to get into the, okay, right, let's roll our sleeves up and do some real work. So my leadership philosophy has become more practical, if that's not mixing the two concepts. I think the second aspect is I become more blunt, not crude, but blunt. It's like, let's say what we mean. I remember Amelia Sordell talking about the personal brand and personal branding. And I thought she was eloquent and really direct in terms of what we get right, what we get wrong, and what we should do. And it's a bit of a wake-up call also for me in terms of my own personal brand. So cut out the ambiguity, make it easy for people to say, cut out the BS, stop hiding behind it, and stop being so beige. Nothing wrong with the colour, but you get my drift. I guess get to the point, say what you think, because then you can start engaging in a proper conversation. And I mentioned this. The topic that's come up really is about the inner self. And I wasn't expecting it as much. Of course, there are some eminent authors on that topic, the inner game, the inner self, the inner critic. But it's come up time and time again from some of the people who've been, if you like, the most analytical, the most systemic in their thinking. So that surprised me. Thank you, Melody. And Costas Markides, the professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at the London Business School and the author of many books, latterly including the Business Model Innovation book. So he asked me this. He said, I suppose one question I would ask you if you're the host is to reflect on your many years as a consultant and discuss with me the key point that I make in our conversation, that CEOs know what they have to do, but either they don't do it, or when they do it the wrong way. Do you agree with this proposition? And if you do, why does this happen? Well, I do agree with the proposition, and not just because I respect, rate, and like you, Costas. And then the question is, of course, why does it happen? Well, I think there's many reasons. And of course, it will depend on the individual, the context, and the organization. But I think there's something around the fear of trying something new. If you've had success in your past career with the existing model, why shake it up? Why take the risk? And incentives, actually, financial incentives may preclude that or make it difficult. It's like, why would I take a long-term view of this particular topic or situation or the success of the organization where actually I'm measured on quarterly earnings? I think sometimes it's not just fear, but it's a lack of skill. They don't know how to do it, whether that is making really complex decisions, whether it is actually firing up innovation, whether it is bringing new voices or existing voices into the organization in terms of inclusion and belonging. They don't have the toolkit. They don't have the firepower. And mixed with fear, they may be afraid to ask for help. I think sometimes there's a mindset problem. I've alluded to this, a know-it-all mindset. Knowledge is great, and I think it's necessary to a degree, but it's like, well, I should know it all. Actually, I do know it all. I'm arrogant. When in fact, they need to ask questions. They need to look around. They need to look at the signals. They need to observe. They need to collate, curate, bring things together, synthesize. And actually, they don't do any of that, or they do it fleetingly, superficially, and then they just come to a view, which is a biased view, it's a limiting view, or just frankly, just plain wrong. I think sometimes, and it's hard to say it, I think some CEOs, even some CEOs, they don't care enough. So they don't do the work because either they're close to retirement and they don't worry enough about legacy and how people think about what they've left in the organization, or they think they've done enough. It's like, I've done enough. This is too hard. That's enough for me. So the degree of complacency and also perhaps to a degree of arrogance, or maybe underneath it all, if they haven't shared it and disclosed it, a degree of burnout. It's like, I can't give anymore. So that's my perspective, Costas. So thank you for all of those brilliant questions from my guests. Let me try and bring things together now. I thought, so what were the most surprising episodes every episode, genuinely every episode has a surprise in terms of how somebody showed up, how they acted differently perhaps into my podcast compared to other ones, or how they differ in how they present versus how they write, or the angle they choose to convey, which was different from what I read in their book or what I read in their statement if they're an executive. So everyone has a surprise, and that's not just me being glib. But let me draw out two individuals in particular. Keaton Hoskins. He had a different background to me and to many other people as an entrepreneur, a reality star, and many other roles. And I thought he was absolutely brilliant in terms of explaining his mindset, his own journey. He was surprising in terms of being more open than I thought. He had an even more methodical approach than I perhaps expected. Some entrepreneurs are very intuitive and struggle to distill what they think. He was incredibly precise, very systematic about how he's built his portfolio businesses, and very generous in terms of sharing his wisdom. Earlier in the podcast series, I spoke with Matt Dawson, the former Rugby World Cup winner from England, I hasten to add and emphasise, especially to my South African guests. No, I jest. He's obviously had to make a number of transitions since leaving that sport. And, Matt he's a big character. If you listen to him on the radio or seen him on the TV, some might say he has a degree of arrogance. I personally don't believe that, but some may say that. And when he talked about the challenges of moving from being the top of your game to then learning a new craft in the business world, where frankly, he was not going from being the elite rugby player to the CEO, he had to sort of work his way up. He was more candid, more humble than perhaps I expected. And I take my hat off to him for doing that. The most moving episode, I think Susan Hayward's episode where she described her very, very challenging childhood, much of which was lived on a boat, sailing around the world, and talking about the hardships she endured and how she had to deal with situations that frankly were unimaginable. But also is moving because how she has developed her life since into a successful, very, very successful businesswoman, consultant, now board member, and also a successful family member and mother and wife of the late and great Sir Jeremy Hayward. So that was moving in terms of the journey. And I frankly at times struggled to keep it together. I was listening to that, having read the book, which was already moving. I was intimidated by a few guests, and I mentioned them, but intimidated because also, and I say this with jest, because the topic that we were discussing was similar to the, if you like, the craft of what we were trying to show or on display. So when I talked to Stephen Rogelberg, he's an expert on meetings, and we were meeting. So I was thinking to myself, am I doing what he would say in terms of framing the conversation, listening attentively? Neil Bearden, brilliant Neil Bearden, talked a lot about, incisive thinking, about storytelling. And so when I was sharing a few of my own anecdotes, there were more anecdotes than stories, I was thinking, gosh, and is he going to think this is a good example to give? And Neil doesn't suffer fools gladly, but again, he was very generous with me. And Tony, I mentioned Tony Martignetti, he all talks about, the power of connections in culture. And so as I was going through the conversation, I was thinking, are we connecting? Are we making that connection? And I think we did. I actually know we did. So those were some of my top episodes. All of them were brilliant. I loved every moment of every of them. Well, most of them anyway. And of course, behind the scenes, things went wrong. For all the professionalism, we had episodes recorded outside, not me, I hasten to add, in restaurant areas with lots of background noise. We had cats and dogs jumping around. We had sirens sometimes, particularly those in cities. Riverside decided to stop working mid-flow, so did my laptop. Lights turned off, camera stopped working. People had coughing fits. But you keep going. So thank you to everyone involved, the guests, the audience, my friends, supporters, family who've encouraged me. I'm going to keep going, at least for the time being. I'm going to try some new formats, some new styles, maybe another solo episode. This is the first. So I'd welcome any feedback on what you've liked today, what you've disliked, what you'd suggest. I really would like some feedback. That's the one thing I'd like more of. I don't get enough feedback on the podcast if I compare it to, say, my social media. So please do come forward. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, David Lancefield, David C. Lancefield, or david@davidlancefield.com. And I'd love your ideas. And I hope today has been helpful. And I hope you go away with some thoughts and ideas and lessons that can help you, whether you are a podcast guest, a podcast host, a presenter, a coach, an executive, an entrepreneur. When you're in a conversation, when you're in a meeting, where you're looking to show your best self. I also hope you've got a new sense of what I think some of the most challenging, stimulating topics are in the fields of strategy, leadership, organizational culture, and self-development, where we're missing a trick, where there's scope for new research, new thinking. And I'd encourage you to fill the space, perhaps to collaborate with me if you're up for it. And as you reflect on today's conversation and as you dig into some of the episodes that I've trailed, just ask yourself, what's the one insight you take away from today? What's the one insight? And what are you going to do about it today, tomorrow, and the next day? Thanks again. My name is David Lancefield. I'm the host of Lancefield Online, and thank you for listening and watching.